The stories of heroism during World War II are legendary. But what about the dark side of the American soldiers who fought in France? Today, we uncover the shocking truths that history often ignores. Welcome back to the channel. We all know the tale of American soldiers storming the beaches of Normandy and liberating France from Nazi occupation. But what about the darker side of that story? In this video, we're diving into the lesser-known and deeply troubling truths about American soldiers in World War II. Stories of violence, revenge, and unreported war crimes that have been hidden in the shadows for decades. On the morning of September 1st, 1939, the world was suddenly thrust into the chaos of war. With little warning and no provocation, Nazi Germany launched a full-scale invasion of Poland, igniting the Second World War. The German military, under the command of Adolf Hitler, implemented a new tactic known as Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, that shattered Poland's defenses. Fast-moving tanks, dive bombers, and highly mobile infantry overwhelmed the unsuspecting Polish forces. Within days, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany, finally acknowledging the scope of Hitler's ambitions. Despite a valiant defense, Poland succumbed to the Nazi onslaught within weeks. As winter set in during 1939 to 1940, a lull in fighting prevailed. But by the spring of 1940, Nazi forces launched another offensive, this time against France and the Low Countries. The exhausted French, still reeling from the aftermath of World War I, struggled to hold their ground. In June 1940, German forces breached the French defenses, plowing through the countryside and reaching the outskirts of Paris. Within 6 weeks, France had fallen to the Nazis. While the British and French retreated, many soldiers escaped to Britain during the Dunkirk evacuation. The occupation of France would last for 4 years, with German troops controlling much of the country. The French population endured years of hardship, marked by harsh Nazi policies, forced labor, and brutal repression. The tides of war began to turn in the east, as the Soviet Union pushed back German forces on the Eastern Front, while British and American troops mounted campaigns in North Africa and Southern Europe. However, France remained firmly under Nazi control until June 6, 1944, when Allied forces launched D-Day and began the brutal process of liberating the country. The liberation of France is often remembered as a heroic achievement, particularly in the United States, where American soldiers are hailed as saviors of the French people. However, the reality of the American occupation in France was more complicated and, in many ways, darker than the heroic narrative suggests. While Allied forces, particularly the American GIs, played a crucial role in liberating France, the actions of some of these soldiers after the fighting ended were far from commendable. In this video, we will uncover the unspoken crimes committed by American soldiers against the French population and examine how these transgressions were handled, or, in many cases, not handled, by the US military. It's important to note that this video isn't meant to diminish the heroism displayed by many American soldiers. The focus here is not on disregarding their bravery and sacrifices, but on recognizing that, like every army in history, the American forces were not without their own faults and failures. War, as history shows, is messy, brutal, and morally ambiguous. No army is free of crimes, and the actions of a few soldiers during the liberation of France have left a long-lasting scar on the memories of the French people. The American occupation of France, more than just heroes. After the fall of France in 1940, General Charles de Gaulle, he fled the country and established the French government in exile. He called on French citizens and soldiers from all corners of the world to rise up and join the fight to liberate their homeland. The formation of the Free French forces gradually took shape, with many French soldiers from colonies like North Africa joining the cause. By the time the war ended, roughly 2/3 of the French forces came from these colonial territories. As these forces organized and trained, the French resistance also gained momentum, with ordinary citizens, men, women, and even teenagers joining the fight against the German occupiers. In the early stages, the French resistance was small and mostly focused on intelligence gathering, sabotaging Nazi operations, and assisting downed Allied airmen. As the war progressed, however, the resistance grew in strength and became increasingly violent, conducting attacks against German forces and collaborators. By the time the Allies launched their invasion of France in 1944, the French resistance had evolved into a well-organized force known as the French Forces of the Interior, FFI, and they played a significant role in the liberation of the country. Allied forces recognized the importance of the resistance, and General Eisenhower even credited their contribution as being equivalent to having 4 full divisions of soldiers. The actual liberation of France began on June 6, 1944, with the Allied landings in Normandy. Over 150,000 American, British, and Canadian troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, initiating one of the largest amphibious assaults in history. The fierce fighting that followed led to a battle of attrition, with cities being taken block by block, building by building. By August 1944, the Allies had made significant progress, and the city of Paris was on the verge of liberation. Encouraged by the approach of American forces, the French resistance launched an uprising against the German occupation, and by August 25, 1944, Paris was freed from Nazi control. However, the experience of liberation was far more complex than the celebratory narrative suggests. While American soldiers were celebrated as heroes in the public memory, the reality of their occupation in France was less than ideal. Following the liberation, the majority of American troops remained in France for the remainder of the war, and many stayed after the German surrender in May 1945. The presence of these soldiers became a source of tension, particularly as the French people began to realize that their liberators were not as benevolent as they had hoped. The dark side of liberation: crime, violence, and abuse. As the American troops settled into France, the behavior of some soldiers took a dark turn. Many of them were far from home, having spent months in brutal combat, and now found themselves in an occupied country with little to do. The psychological toll of war, combined with the stress of displacement and boredom, led to a troubling wave of behavior that would stain the American legacy in France. While the majority of American soldiers did not engage in criminal activities, a significant number of them did. American troops began to engage in theft, vandalism, and drunken brawls. There were reports of soldiers driving recklessly through towns, destroying property, and even running over civilians. What was initially seen as an unfortunate side effect of post-war stress soon escalated into more serious transgressions. French citizens, who had once viewed the GIs as heroes, began to view them with suspicion, if not outright disdain. But the most horrifying crimes committed by American soldiers in France were sexual in nature. According to reports, American soldiers assaulted and raped hundreds, if not thousands, of French women during and after the war. The problem was so widespread that, by the time American forces began to occupy France in full, the military had to deal with numerous complaints from both French citizens and military officials about the behavior of the soldiers. What makes these abuses particularly disturbing is the military's tacit encouragement of such behavior. As early as 1944, Life magazine published an article describing France as a tremendous brothel, framing French women as eager partners for the American GIs. This portrayal fed into a broader cultural narrative within the US military that viewed French women as sexually liberated and ready to reward their American liberators. In response to the mounting complaints, the US military set up military-sponsored brothels in some areas, and many soldiers sought out prostitutes with little regard for the ethics involved. However, this sanctioned prostitution only solved part of the problem. As the war ended and American soldiers settled into occupation, many turned to rape and sexual assault when they could not access prostitution or when they felt entitled to take what they wanted. These crimes were widespread, and the response from the US military was grossly inadequate. Although some soldiers were tried and convicted for rape, many others escaped justice. The true scale of the abuse remains difficult to ascertain, but historian J. Robert Lilly estimates that the number of rapes committed by American soldiers in France during and after the war could be as high as 354,000. Shockingly, many of those convicted of sexual assault were African American soldiers. About 72% of the men tried for rape by the US military were black, and nearly all of the soldiers executed for rape were African American. This disproportionate targeting of black soldiers reflects the deeply entrenched racism of the time, as the US military remained segregated during World War II. These soldiers were often relegated to support roles, far from the front lines, and were accused of rape at a higher rate than their white counterparts. Many of them were convicted, not necessarily because of their crimes, but because they were seen as easy targets for the military's racial prejudices. The legacy of the American occupation in France. As American forces withdrew from France, the number of crimes committed by soldiers decreased, but the rate of abuse per soldier actually increased. Despite the American military's efforts to address the issue of sexual violence, most soldiers who committed such crimes were never brought to justice. The true extent of the suffering caused by American soldiers in France remains difficult to quantify. But what is clear is that thousands of women who had once hoped for liberation from the Nazis found themselves subjected to the abuse of those they had trusted. The legacy of the American occupation in France is a complex one. While the bravery and sacrifice of American soldiers cannot be denied, the crimes committed by some of them against the French people are a dark stain on the history of the war. War is a brutal and morally complex experience, and as much as we celebrate the victories and heroism of those who fought, we must also acknowledge the atrocities that occur, even at the hands of those who are supposed to be liberators. History is full of contradictions, and in the case of the American occupation of France, two things can be true at once. American soldiers were heroes, and some of them were perpetrators of horrific crimes. History isn't just about the victories and the heroes. It's about the full truth, no matter how uncomfortable. If you found this video thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories from history. And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about this hidden chapter of World War II?